begin by thanking for the invitation again here to Bernard, to Caroline. It's very nice to be back, and I will speak in English, and if you have questions later on, you can post them in French, and I'll try to answer them as well. So that's, yeah, and I will read my paper, so I'll start now. So the title is Criticism, Therapeutics and Pharmacology in the New Nuclear Age. Let me begin with some words about the beginning at the start of this encounter that will concentrate on the words we can pronounce on the present and on the future, on what is, with Lenin's famous formulation, to be done, and equally, we might say cautiously after invoking Lenin, what is to be avoided in this conjecture of political, cultural, and epistemic crisis. The words I wish to begin with might describe commonplace knowledge that are doubly tautological as they deal with the beginning itself. Around 200,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans appeared in Africa. 50,000 years ago, the Upper Paleolithic Revolution occurred and ushered in what has been called behavioral modernity. This consisted of, in short, humans starting to express themselves in cultural terms, or at least in a mode of expression intelligible to us and traceable by us. It is from this period we start finding the first musical instruments and sculptures, the Chauvet cave paintings constituting a proto-cinema in the analysis of both Bernhard Stiegler and the German filmmaker Werner Herzog are 30,000 years old. The oldest remnants of buildings erected by humans are a mere 7,000 years old and belong to the megalithic period. I wish to take this opportunity at the occupied epineu to think about a material creating a condition relating both to the horizon of time and the speed of techniques. This humanly produced material that I will speak about is radioactive waste. What are the implications of a poison that will remain dangerous for 100,000 years, or, in other words, a time span that is so inconceivable that we might as well turn to the words from the book of Revelation used to express multitude, 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of thousands. This material has to be stored in specially built repositories, able to last, thus, almost 15 times longer than the oldest human construction we know. Warning signs has to be written in order to attempt communication with civilizations situated further into the future than the first stirrings of the recognizably coherent cultural expressions of human life on planet lie in the past. In an era characterized by catastrophic short-termism, to which our reliance on nuclear energy can be seen as belonging, we are thus faced with having to consider such an absolutely long timescale that it confuses the boundaries of perpetuity and eternity, leaving us with an eternity created by man, and this regardless of whether we like the notion of nuclear power or nuclear weapons or not. The waste is there, an indestructible remnant. It is now soon 30 years ago, in 1984, that Jacques Derrida sought to think through the nuclear weapon as a reality and nuclear conflict as a fiction in an essay entitled No Apocalypse, Not Now, that turned towards both the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation, arguably written by the same John. In this reflection on nuclear technology and the social organ of the literary archive, Derrida also discusses the pharmacon and the use of critique. What remain less clear are the therapeutic implications of both the pharmacology and the critique, terms that will occupy us during these days. This paper is part of a work in progress in which I study a shift in the pharmacology of the nuclear from the height of the Second Cold War, in which Derrida wrote his essay, to today. Working from the position of a critic, I try to analyze cultural artifacts from cinema to contemporary art that make this shift traceable. It is also my purpose to search for a position in which to reflect on the practice of criticism itself. Derrida began his essay by substituting the word, logos, at the beginning with speed, wishing to say a word first about speed, adding, at the beginning there will have been speed. He will continue to rewrite the Genesis according to John through the same apostle's vision of the apocalypse that constitutes the last chapter of the Bible. In the beginning is the end, and the end is the beginning, we might add, alluding to the Alpha and Omega referred to in the book of Revelation. We find ourselves by the time barrier invoked by Stigler in the beginning of the first volume of Technics and Time. It is here that technics evolves more quickly than culture, and where time has leapt outside of itself into the machine or technical complex to become speed. Stigler asked what type of shock will be produced in breaking the time barrier when speed goes faster than time. How does the temporal boom sound like? The implication, he continues, would be that speed is older than time, a type of speed unthought by philosophy just as technics itself. At the time of Derrida's essay, the Second Cold War stood at its zenith. Threat of total nuclear war had rarely been so present before. The Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel, who knew that the impossible was possible, remarked that it seemed like maybe the whole world, strangely, has turned Jewish. The temporal boom would come from the first missile fired in a global thermonuclear war. And there seemed to be, in the words of Derrida, a course de vitesse towards the trigger. This condition brought Derrida to a reflection on critical speed. One should not rush into conclusions regarding speed, he advised, and first argued for a critical deceleration. At the same time, there was also the pressing need to act now, lest not to walk into the future as suicidal sleepwalkers. The need to act slowly and quickly at the same time, Derrida described as an aporia of speed, even though speed was in every sense as ambivalent as the logos Derrida had substituted it with, a logos he in Plato's Pharmacy described it as at once good and bad. In the context of the bomb, the use of the speed is directly tactical, rushing to the warning of watch out, don't go too fast. Derrida then formulates his nuclear criticism as accelerated text in the shape of 7 missiles or missives, in a direct reference to God's message to the 7 churches of Asia to be delivered by John according to his vision. Among the most important of the missives is the second one, in which Derrida argues for that humanists, experts on text, are eminently competent to criticize such a fabulously textual event such as a nuclear war, an event facilitated through human and technological communication that has not happened and therefore relies on the, quote, sophistry of belief and the rhetorical simulation of text, end of quote. The nuclear catastrophe that humanists were competent to direct their critical apparatus towards was for Derrida the absolute pharmacon. Derrida refers to textual event that was prevented from becoming reality by the enormity of its implications. It was something whose poles were impossibly entangled in without any hope of or threat that it might have time to evolve into a more recognizable pharmacological entity. He significantly invokes the notion of the absolute later when he states that the nuclear epoch is not an epoch, that is, not the knowledge at the end of history, but instead the epoche of absolute knowledge. This absoluteness, which can maybe more aptly be described as the absolute suspension, is indicative of the critical moment in which Derrida wrote. In a few minutes, a nuclear missile fired from a submarine could hit any major population center. Absoluteness was a position in which categories of reality and fiction seemed to be obliterated by speed traveling faster than time. Rather than the nuclear constituting an apotheosis of simulation, as Jean Baudrillard claimed in 1981, it was speed that had suspended time and reached an apotheosis, had become godlike in other terms. And it was maybe not that the real and the fictional had been suspended in an epoche, but that the oscillations between the reality of the threat and the fiction of the disaster took place at such great speed that it became impossible to separate them, this leading to the constitution of a profoundly psychotic era. Where does the absolute suspension leave the nature of the pharmacon? First, we might note that the book of Revelation, just like the Gospel of John, with its Antichrist or beast versus Christ polarity, or its pitting of Babylon against Jerusalem, which is by Derrida, is a quintessentially pharmacological work. Hölderlin, drawing from the same book, wrote the following in his poem Patmos, entitled after the island where John received his vision. First I read the part in German and then a very literal translation to English. Nah ist und schwer zu fassen der Gott, wo aber Gefahr ist, wächst das Rettende auch. Near is and difficult to understand is God, but where danger is grows the saving as well, the saving in French, le salutaire. This is the poem that Heidegger would come back to in his 1955 lecture, The Question Concerning Technology, and which helped him formulate the notion of the saving power that technology brings. In Derrida's text, the most important pharmacology comes, I suggest, in an unexpected place that is not the absolute pharmacon, and this is speed rather than the nuclear techniques. It is speed that has the ability to produce a pharmacological outcome with critical potential, as opposed to the absolute pharmacon that leads to the limits of criticism. Both acceleration and deceleration have the ability to lead to good as well as bad results. The threat to pharmacology lies in automation. Accelerating criticism can lead to machine-like conclusions. Decelerating criticism can turn us into suicidal sleepwalkers, falling back on commonplace categories, automatic stereotypes. Reading the essay in this way is also to de-automatize Derrida's presupposition towards the end of the same text, where he appears to treat the hope of criticism with skepticism, a defeatism criticized by Stigler in Ce que fait la vie vaut la peine d'être vécu. It is as though Derrida, by this stage, has forgotten that he has already illustrated that a relational criticism is possible and not excluded by the implication of the absolute suspension. I need not point out that the criticism based on acceleration towards the automation remains vital to this day to counter what in the invitation to this event was called, with another invocation of the book of Revelation, the Cavaliers de l'Apocalypse that are working through matrices of automation to destroy public power. The nuclear era, dominated by the threat of nuclear annihilation, displayed the most extreme instance of automation to date. This was amply illustrated in the cinema of the time. If philosophy had repressed techniques and made it unfought, popular culture had faced the issue repeatedly. I don't have time here to get into detailed discussion of these films that I'm working with, but it suffices to say that cinema of the nuclear war in the early 1980s was deeply preoccupied with the implication of taking the human out of the loop. Here the machine represents speed and the human time. As long as the human is involved in the decision-making with its human critical faculties, that is, not acting as a robot, he or she can decelerate the process that leads to war. The process is rendered automatic when machines can give orders to machines, with the justification that the cours de vitesse makes it too slow to involve humans, or where humans are trained to act mechanically. With the language of Stigler, we can describe this process as short-circuiting. In Derrida, we can see the short-circuiting at play in the sophistry as opposed to criticism that represent the most crudely opinionated psychagogy, the most vulgar psychology. This means that a failure of criticism is also the failure of education in terms of psychagogy. If we read Derrida with some of the most important films from the period, as well as through Stigler's project, we can see that criticism, or a critical education, is a matter of therapeutic de-automizing the noetic. It's a matter of therapeutic de-automizing the noetic and the technical. And here I use the word de-automizing rather than deproletarianization to show how we can refer to something that is also a technical process. This critical acceleration should lead to a position that allows for the subsequent deceleration needed in the long circuit of thought. What the popular culture of the period often argued is that an acceleration towards automation with tragic certainty leads to the end or reversal of civilization. The horrifyingly sublime moment is, tellingly, no longer the mushroom cloud, but the moment your own missiles have left the silos, because it is then you know that the enemy will automatically retaliate, and this is the point where social order collapses. The pharmacological moment pointing towards a possible therapeutics in Derrida's text here does rest more in the discussion on speed than in his category of the textual. The pharmacon can only be relative. But to approach a fully pharmacological situation where criticism is part of a therapeutic process of care, it is also necessary to have a pharmacology of not only text and speed, but also of matter. Material engagement in contemporary art shows how this can be done. The use of radioactive material by figures such as US artist James Acord and the Swedish artist Lina Selander gives an opening to the therapeutic potential of the radioactive. Not in practical terms in healthcare, where we already use radioactive material, but for our civilization. Though this is not to be seen as an endorsement of nuclear power, it is an argument built around the indisputable fact that a vast amount of radioactive waste already exists, which needs to be disposed regardless of the future of the nuclear industry. Some excess of waste needs to be stored, even if we learn how to recycle most of the waste already in existence. And this recycling happens mostly in France, I think, now. And this situation is a reality just like the digital condition of the present. Before arriving to this man-made eternity, we need to briefly trace the pharmacology of the nuclear between Derrida's text and today. After the end of the Cold War, popular cinema returned in many instances to the themes of threats exogenous to the planet, as opposed to nuclear war belonging to our civilization. Something from outer space was approaching Earth, asteroids, comets, or aliens, and had the ability to wipe out human life in no time at all, like the cancelled apocalypse of the Cold War. Between this threat and human civilization, there was a familiar coup de vitesse. Humanity prevailed in the end, in these films, by the judicious use of nuclear weapons directed towards what put the planet in danger. The bombs that had hitherto represented the absolute suspension and, to speak with Derrida, the risk of the remainderless destruction of the archive, had become that which saved, das Rettende, or le salutaire. And a link to this in general society development could be the return to nuclear power as a way to counter the threat from global warming that there was much discussed, at least before Fukushima. The therapeutic potential of spontaneous pharmacology in popular culture, as opposed to its critical sibling, is clearly problematic, as the relativization of the nuclear absolute after the Cold War illustrates. Nuclear weapons and nuclear energy that had previously threatened planetary civilizations now became what saved the same civilization. To speak in religious terminology, it was the Antichrist, the beast, being put in the position of Christ or the Savior. A clear example of noetic automation in which that which destroyed became that which saved without the intermediate stage of a reflection in a vulgarly uncritical relationship to the pharmacon. What was missing, and this is the role of criticism, was an acceleration leading to the automation of techniques and thought, though this is a thought that knows that it cannot make itself free from neither techniques nor all its own modes of automation. A discussion of the nuclear techniques in 2013 is not a mere reminder of the Cold War, and I attempt to get to grips with the legacy of that conflict. Digital automation is what challenges the status of criticism and therapeutic and constitutes the horizon of speed today. While this is true, the fact is, as alluded to in the beginning, that nuclear technology has given us something that will be with us to the end. This can be seen as a gift in the full pharmacological meaning of the gift, as outlined by Marcel Mauss. When discussing the etymology of the gift in Germanic languages, Mose identifies the gift as meaning both un don as well as a poison. This move reminds us of Freud's discussion in the interpretation of dreams, where the dream is said to ignore the categories of antithesis and contradiction, or where the negative and positive sense are represented as one of the same and the same thing. And then later in Freud's commentary on Karl Abel and the Gegensinn or contronymic meaning of primal words. It's not my intention here to get into a discussion of the complicated standing of the gift in continental philosophy. Well, for this I will recommend Gerard's book, that is here somewhere, The Politics of the Gift. But it's my belief that pharmacology can be fruitfully read through this tradition all the way back to the gift of writing offered by Thamos the Theot in Plato's Phaedrus. But first of all, I need to explain the counterintuitive proposition that nuclear waste is anything but a poison. In Given Time, Donner le Temps, Derrida puts Moses laid aside on the gift as also meaning poison at the very beginning of his exposition, making it stand for the reversal of the good into something bad. It is now in what now seems like a familiar move, Derrida then goes on to go beyond the relative pharmacon to the absolute, which in many ways ceases to be pharmacological. For a gift to be only a positive gift and not a poison, it has to not be perceived or received as a gift. Neither the donor nor the donee must have any consciousness of the gift, nor any memory or recognition. Derrida is so vested in cancelling the poisonous part of the gift to get to a true gift outside of economy, a completely ethical gift, that he states that Moses' pharmacological gift is not a gift. But the end result of this search for a gift without ambivalence leads us back to the fabulously textual, at the margins of the describable that has not yet happened. In other words, back to the territory of the messianic. The focus on the textual as a site of pure difference becomes a way out of the specificity of pharmacology, which in other words also implies a turning away from therapeutic action. This further undermines the role of the practice of criticism if we see it as concerned with turning the pharmacological processes towards a therapeutic or curative end. The only thing that the gift of Mos, the ambivalent gift, gives, according to Derrida, is time, implied in the economic or social bond between giver and receiver. This gift of time is crucial when considering the gift of nuclear waste. His radical poison relies on its imposition of not on the imposition of a countergift, but on the mere necessity of us, the receivers, handling the material itself. The social bond implied in the gift has a dimension of time that can hardly be fathomed. It is not a coincidence that Werner Herzog, in his documentary about the 30,000-year-old Chauvet Caves paintings, ends by a poetic digression to a nearby nuclear power station. Just as Chauvet is a proto-cinema to Herzog's cinema, the nuclear, as an even more refined form of techniques, opens up to an extremely long-term time scale towards the future. Another documentary, Michael Madsen's Into Eternity from 2010, is shaped partly as an epistolary attempt to communicate with a future civilization that encounters the nuclear trace from ours. The film, centered on the construction of a nuclear repository in the Finnish bedrock, repeatedly returns to the generational bond to the future that the poisonous gift demands. The conceptually most challenging task of the Finnish engineers is to try to devise warning signs that can be understood not only in 1,000 years, but also in 100,000 years. For these to last as long as the nuclear waste and be legible, they are made to look like the card signs we associate with the Upper Paleolithic period of Chauvet. One of the forerunners in thinking pharmacology through radioactive material was the US sculptor James Acord, who also worked on warning signs for radioactive waste repositories. To make these as durable as possible, he used radioactive material in the sculptures themselves. His starting position was that sculpture, quote, deals with the technology of our society at any given time, end of quote. Just as the carvers of stone had produced the first Venus figurines, he took the tools and material that his society had at its disposal. Provocatively, his aim was also to do something beautiful with the poisonous gift in incorporating radioactive material with his art. Along with the warning signs, he also made reliquaries, and this link between the radioactive techne and the trace has been taken further by the Swedish artist Lina Selander, who in recent years has made a number of works exploring fossils, photographic imprints, and radioactivity. Selander carefully avoids an overtly aesthetic approach to radioactivity. Her works feature visits back to the horror of nuclear sites, such as Chernobyl and Hiroshima. But she does use radioactive material, for example, placed upon photographic paper, bridging the status of the nuclear as a material trace and a trace in our culture of the image. We again return to the notion that man-made radioactive material is there whether we wish it to be or not. Automation via techniques can also express itself as foreclosure, repression, and forgetfulness. The examples of films and art approaching the new nuclear epoch is exactly that, and not the examples of films and art approaching a new nuclear epoch that is exactly that, an epoch, and not an epoche, constitute critical acceleration towards a de-automation and the re-establishing of a pharmacological situation, even in this most extreme example of a truly poisonous gift. They make us able to think in terms of therapeutics. The social bond implied in the extreme gift of time demands the transmission of generational knowledge that cannot be left to private interests, such as an industry, as the risk then would be of a convenient forgetting. An entirely new set of demands have also been raised in the buildings of the nuclear repository, not only in linguistic challenges of communicating with the future, but also the material knowledge of constructing extremely durable sites. All this is motivated by a sense of responsibility. When there is no doubt that the gift is poisonous, we can also speak of a moral debt in the moment of giving it. Thinking through the nuclear leads us to a gift of time and a depth implied in the giver and not merely in the receiver. There is thus scope for a new moral economy that can help us in understanding what type of gift giving we pass on to coming generations by merely passing on the current socio-economic conjecture. Pharmacology through the nuclear underlies the necessity of critique and then subsequently of the establishment of a social projections into the future. This last stage is only possible if pharmacology goes beyond the textual dimension in Derrida and engages with the present material condition. The discussion of the nuclear condition that I have attempted here can be seen as an extreme manifestation of something that is also applicable to the digital condition of late capitalism. To paraphrase Hölderlin, we might say that where the most extreme danger is, grows that which has the greatest potential to save. Long-term disposal of nuclear waste would necessitate a planetary responsibility in economic, political, and technological terms, something that is equally true for other poisonous gifts such as global warmings or the systematic destruction of attention. The extreme speed of the nuclear condition in the 1980s has thus led to a situation in which, paradoxically, the nuclear of today represents an immense time scale. The price is the poison. I would suggest, in conclusion, that the digital condition can, through an accelerated critique, be brought from the reign of speed to the hope of time, and this is the process, and this process does not have to create as much of a debt or guilt, to invoke another Germanic wordplay in Schuld, that is guilt as well as debt, in the giver as our nuclear adventure has generated. And the hope of time, as opposed to the messianic beyond, is eminently grounded in the concrete material and concrete politics, even if it points towards 100,000 years into the future. Thank you very much.